The quiet hum of voices in the conference room gave way to the sound of laughter. Jack Murphy forced a smile as another one of Ethan's jokes landed perfectly with the team. Ethan Calloway had a way of commanding attention. He wasn't just Jack's business partner. He was the yin to his yang. Where Jack was methodical and precise, Ethan was bold, magnetic, and, at times, reckless. Together, they'd built Summit Solutions from a garage startup to a multimillion-dollar enterprise. But tonight, something felt off. Jack leaned back in his chair, letting the celebratory buzz of the quarterly review wash over him. His eyes wandered to his wife, Laura, standing near the corner of the room. She was wearing a sleek, black dress that hugged her figure just enough to remind Jack how lucky he was, or had been. Anyway, lately their connection had felt muted. He watched as Laura sipped her wine and laughed at something Ethan said. The ease between them struck an odd chord in Jack's mind. Maybe it was the way her hand lingered just a second too long on Ethan's arm, or how Ethan's smile widened whenever Laura glanced his way. "You look like you're solving equations in your head again," Ethan said, sliding into the chair next to Jack and snapping him out of his thoughts. "Relax, Jack. It's a celebration." Jack chuckled. "You know me, always thinking about the next move." "That's what makes us a good team," Ethan replied, raising his glass in a mock toast. "You think. I charm." Jack's smile wavered, but he raised his glass anyway. It was true. Ethan was the face of the company, the one who dazzled clients and investors alike. Jack preferred to work behind the scenes, where he could ensure everything ran smoothly. Tonight, however, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Later that night, after the last of the team had trickled out and the caterers began cleaning up, Jack found Laura by the balcony. The city skyline shimmered behind her, and for a moment, he was struck by her beauty. She'd always had a way of looking effortless, even in chaos. "Hey," he said softly, stepping beside her. "You've been quiet tonight." Laura turned to him with a faint smile. "Just tired, that's all. It's been a long week." Jack nodded, though her response felt rehearsed. He reached for her hand, but she slipped it into her coat pocket before he could touch her. His chest tightened, but he said nothing. "Ethan really knows how to work a room, huh?" she said, glancing back toward the conference hall. "Yeah, that's Ethan," Jack replied, his tone careful. "Always the life of the party." Laura's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's impressive. You're lucky to have him as a partner." Jack's stomach churned. "Lucky, yeah." They drove home in silence, the tension between them as thick as the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge. In the weeks that followed, Jack tried to push the nagging thoughts from his mind. He threw himself into work, hoping the grind would drown out his doubts. But the small moments began piling up. There was the time Laura received a text during dinner and excused herself to the bathroom for nearly 15 minutes. When she returned, her face was flushed, and she quickly changed the subject. Then there was the Saturday morning when she left for yoga, but came back 3 hours later smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his. Jack told himself it was nothing. Laura was his wife and Ethan was his friend. He had no reason to doubt either of them. But as the days turned into weeks, the unease gnawed at him like termites in the foundation of their marriage. One evening, Jack decided to confide in his best friend, Mark. They met at a dive bar near the office, a spot they'd frequented since their college days. Mark was the kind of guy who always knew what to say, whether it was a joke to lighten the mood or a piece of hard truth no one else dared to deliver. "So, let me get this straight," Mark said, swirling his beer. "You think your wife is—" "What? Flirting with Ethan?" "I don't know," Jack admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It's just this feeling. I can't explain it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Feelings aren't facts, man. But if your gut's telling you something, you can't ignore it. Have you talked to Laura?" Jack shook his head. "What am I supposed to say? Hey, honey, are you sleeping with my business partner?" Mark winced. "Fair point, but maybe start smaller. Ask her what's been bothering her lately. See if she opens up." Jack sighed. "Yeah, maybe." But deep down, he knew a conversation wouldn't be enough. He needed proof, something concrete to either confirm or dispel his suspicions. The breaking point came during a company retreat in Napa Valley. The team had spent the day touring vineyards and brainstorming ideas for the next product launch. That evening, as everyone gathered around the fire pit, Jack noticed Laura and Ethan sharing a private laugh. It was the kind of laugh reserved for inside jokes, the kind that made Jack feel like an outsider in his own marriage. He excused himself from the group and headed back to their cabin, his mind racing. When Laura returned an hour later, her face was flushed, and she avoided his eyes. "Where were you?" Jack asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Just talking with some of the team," Laura replied, brushing past him. "Why?" Jack stared at her, searching her face for any sign of guilt or remorse. But she looked calm, too calm. "No reason," he said finally, though his heart pounded in his chest. That night, as Laura slept beside him, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Jack Murphy's life had always been built on logic. His entire career as an entrepreneur revolved around solving complex problems, dissecting challenges until solutions emerged. But this, the gnawing suspicion about Laura and Ethan, wasn't a problem he could rationalize his way through. It was chaos, messy, and emotional, the kind of thing he never thought would invade his carefully structured life. The first real crack in the facade came one lazy Sunday morning. Laura was in the kitchen, humming softly as she poured herself a second cup of coffee. Jack leaned against the doorframe, watching her. She seemed relaxed, almost too much so. "Who's been texting you so much lately?" he asked casually, nodding toward her phone on the counter. He tried to keep his tone light, but he could feel his pulse quickening. Laura glanced at her phone, her expression unreadable. "Oh, it's nothing. Just some group chats with friends." "Which friends?" he pressed, instantly regretting how suspicious he sounded. Laura turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What's with the third degree? I can't have friends now." Jack forced a smile. "I didn't mean it like that. Just curious." She shrugged, grabbing her phone and slipping it into her back pocket. "You don't need to worry, Jack. It's nothing important." But as she walked past him, he caught a faint whiff of her perfume, mingled with something else, something masculine. Jack began noticing more little things after that. Laura's schedule suddenly became unpredictable. She'd mention errands or appointments that didn't add up. Once, she told him she was meeting her friend Kelly for lunch, but when he casually asked Kelly about it later, she blinked in confusion and said she hadn't seen Laura in weeks. It wasn't just Laura, though. Ethan's behavior had shifted too. The man who once thrived on sharing every detail of his life, his latest dates, gym routines, and weekend adventures, had grown more secretive. During meetings, Ethan's eyes would dart to Laura whenever she walked into the room. And while Jack couldn't quite put his finger on it, there was a tension between them that hadn't been there before. The moment that tipped Jack over the edge happened late one night. Laura had fallen asleep early, her phone abandoned on the nightstand. Jack had never been the kind of husband who snooped, but as he stared at the glowing screen, he felt an overwhelming urge to know. The phone was locked, of course, but Jack knew Laura's passcode. His fingers hesitated over the screen. If he did this, there was no going back. He took a deep breath and unlocked it. The first few messages were innocuous. Texts from Kelly, reminders from the gym, a couple of spam emails. But then he saw it. A thread labeled E. His stomach twisted as he opened the conversation. The messages were vague, but the tone was unmistakable. "Ethan, tonight was perfect. Wish we could have stayed longer." "Laura, me too. But we have to be careful." "Ethan, I hate this. I want more than stolen moments." "Laura, you know we can't." Jack stared at the screen, the words blurring as a wave of nausea hit him. He felt like he'd been punched in the gut. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. The betrayal was right there, spelled out in black and white. He deleted the thread, locked the phone, and set it back on the nightstand. Then he stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink as he tried to steady himself. His reflection in the mirror looked foreign, haunted. The next morning, Jack was quiet at breakfast. Laura chatted about her plans for the day, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. "You okay?" she asked, sipping her coffee. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But tired didn't begin to cover it. His mind was racing, replaying the texts over and over. He couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed more. Proof she couldn't deny. Jack began keeping a closer eye on Laura. He started noting her comings and goings, checking her mileage when she returned from appointments, and paying attention to her body language when she talked about Ethan. One afternoon, he decided to test a theory. "Hey," he said as they cleared the dinner table. "I was thinking we could do a double date with Ethan and his new girlfriend. What's her name? Vanessa?" Laura froze for a split second before recovering. "Oh, I don't think they're seeing each other anymore." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Really? Ethan hasn't mentioned anything." She shrugged. "I guess he's keeping it quiet." Jack smiled inwardly. Ethan never kept anything quiet, at least not until now. That week, Jack installed a GPS tracker in Laura's car. Felt extreme, invasive even, but he was desperate. If she wasn't going to be honest with him, he'd have to find the truth himself. The tracker revealed what he feared most. Laura wasn't running errands or going to yoga classes. She was visiting a hotel on the other side of town. Not once, but 3 times in 1 week. Jack's worst suspicions were confirmed when he saw Ethan's car in the parking lot one afternoon. The sleek black Audi was impossible to miss. Jack confided in Mark again, his voice low and strained as they sat in the same dive bar. "She's meeting him," Jack said, his hands clenched around his beer. "At a hotel." Mark's expression darkened. "Jesus, Jack. Are you sure?" "I saw his car." Mark let out a long breath. "What are you going to do?" Jack stared at the scratched surface of the bar. "I don't know. But I'm not letting them get away with this." For the first time in his life, Jack felt like a man untethered, floating in the chaos of betrayal and rage. He didn't know where this would end, but one thing was certain. Ethan and Laura had no idea what was coming. The world outside the Murphy home seemed untouched, suburban perfection. Neatly trimmed lawns, golden sunlight streaming through oak trees, and the faint sound of kids playing down the street. Inside, however, Jack's world was crumbling. Every time Laura smiled at him, every time Ethan cracked a joke at work, it felt like another knife twisting in his chest. But Jack wasn't a man to crumble under pressure. He'd built a company from the ground up, fought off competitors, and survived the gauntlet of Silicon Valley. He could handle this, or so he told himself. It started with a burner phone. Jack didn't want to leave a digital trail, so he picked up a cheap, prepaid device at a gas station on the other side of town. That night, while Laura slept, he downloaded a voice-activated recording app and synced it to a discreet bug he planned to plant in her car. He hesitated as he held the tiny device, his reflection staring back at him from the bathroom mirror. Was this really who he was now? A husband who spied on his wife? But then he remembered the texts, the hotel parking lot, and the way she lied to his face with such ease. "This is for the truth," he muttered to himself as he slipped the bug into the lining of Laura's glove compartment the next morning. The first recording came back blank, just the sound of the car's engine and faint radio static. The second day wasn't much better, though Jack caught snippets of Laura humming to herself and making a grocery list aloud. But on the third day, Jack hit gold. "I can't keep sneaking around like this, Ethan," Laura's voice crackled through the recording. She sounded frustrated, her words clipped. Ethan's voice followed, calm and confident as always. "We don't have a choice, Laura. You think Jack isn't suspicious? He's not an idiot." Jack paused the playback, his chest tightening. The confirmation of his suspicions was like a punch to the gut, even though he'd already known the truth. "Don't worry," Ethan continued. "I've got it under control. Just stick to the plan." "What plan?" Jack whispered to himself, rewinding the recording and playing it again. But the conversation ended abruptly, replaced by the sound of tires crunching gravel. The more he listened, the more questions piled up. What was Ethan planning? How long had this been going on? Was it just an affair? Or was there something more sinister at play? Jack decided it was time to escalate. If they thought he was clueless, he'd use that to his advantage. He started playing the role of the oblivious husband, letting Laura think she'd pulled the wool over his eyes. "Are you working late again tonight?" he asked one evening as she slipped into her coat. "Yeah," she said with a quick smile. "Ethan and I have to finalize the budget proposal before the board meeting." "Sounds important," Jack replied, keeping his tone neutral. "It is. Don't wait up, okay?" She leaned in to kiss him on the cheek, but he turned slightly, her lips grazing his jaw instead. "Good luck," he said, watching her walk out the door. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, Jack grabbed his own keys and followed. The hotel wasn't far, just a modest mid-range chain on the outskirts of town. Jack parked a block away and walked to the lot, keeping to the shadows. Laura's car was already there, parked next to Ethan's Audi. Jack stayed in his car for nearly an hour, his mind racing. What would he do if he confronted them now? Burst into the room, screaming like a man unhinged? Or would he wait for them to leave, tail them, and collect more evidence? His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Mark. "You okay, man?" Mark's voice came through the line, concerned but steady. "Yeah," Jack lied. "You sound like crap." Jack sighed, leaning back in his seat. "They're at a hotel right now. Together." Mark swore under his breath. "You want me to come out there?" "No," Jack said quickly. "I need to handle this myself. But thanks. Just don't do anything stupid, okay? They're not worth it." Jack hung up, staring at the hotel entrance. A part of him wanted to charge inside and let the fury he'd been suppressing explode, but another part told him to wait. He needed to think, to plan. If he acted too soon, they could turn the situation against him. The next day at the office, Jack played his part perfectly. "Big night last night?" Jack asked Ethan as they grabbed coffee in the break room. Ethan glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." "Yeah, Laura mentioned you two were working late. She said you've been a lifesaver lately." Ethan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Teamwork makes the dream work, right?" Jack chuckled, though the sound was hollow. He studied Ethan carefully, noting the slight tension in his jaw and the way his eyes darted away. For the first time, Jack felt like he had the upper hand. That evening, Jack combed through old emails and company records, looking for anything that might connect Ethan and Laura beyond the affair. He found nothing concrete, but a pattern began to emerge. Ethan had been lobbying for a significant change to their partnership agreement, a change that would give him more control over the company's finances. Jack's hands clenched into fists as realization dawned. This wasn't just about lust or betrayal. Ethan was trying to undermine him professionally as well. The following week, Jack set his trap. He arranged a meeting with their legal team under the guise of discussing new contracts. As Ethan reviewed the documents, Jack casually brought up a clause that protected their intellectual property. "Smart move including this," Jack said, feigning ignorance. "Wouldn't want anyone making unauthorized decisions." Ethan stiffened but quickly covered it with a laugh. "Yeah, can't be too careful." But Jack saw through the facade. Ethan was nervous, and Jack knew why. He just didn't have all the pieces yet. Later that night, Jack sat alone in his home office, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. His laptop screen glowed in the dim light, a blank document waiting to be filled with the next phase of his plan. He wasn't just going to confront them. He was going to dismantle their lives the way they tried to dismantle his. But first, he needed more. Jack Murphy sat in his car outside the same hotel again, the neon sign casting long, jagged shadows across the dashboard. He had been here for hours this time, listening to the steady buzz of his phone's recording app. His patience was wearing thin, but he knew he needed to be methodical. It was almost midnight when the door to the hotel room finally opened. Jack's breath hitched as he saw Laura step out, her hair slightly disheveled and her coat draped over one arm. Ethan followed a moment later. His tie loosened and his usual air of cocky confidence dimmed under the dim streetlights. Jack gripped the steering wheel, forcing himself to stay put. His heart screamed at him to confront them, to demand answers, but his head told him to wait. Not here. Not now. Instead, he picked up his camera, another addition to his arsenal of evidence. He snapped several photos of them walking to their cars, their heads close as if they were whispering secrets only they could understand. Ethan opened the door of Laura's car, a mockery of chivalry, and gave her a lingering glance before walking to his own. Jack lowered the camera, his hands shaking. Back at home, Jack downloaded the images to his laptop, his face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. He organized them into folders, alongside the recordings and GPS logs he'd been collecting. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough for Jack. He didn't just want to catch them, he wanted to understand. How long had this been going on? What were they saying behind his back? Were they planning to run away together? Or was this affair just another way for Ethan to edge him out of the company? The answer came 2 days later. Jack had set up a meeting with Ethan at their favorite lunch spot, a small, upscale bistro that catered to Silicon Valley's elite. Ethan arrived late, as always, flashing a grin that made Jack's skin crawl. "Sorry, man," Ethan said, sliding into the booth. "You know how it is. Meetings running over and all that." "No problem," Jack replied, forcing a smile. "I ordered us the usual." Ethan nodded, his charm in full force. "You're the best. So what's up? You said you wanted to talk strategy?" Jack leaned forward, studying Ethan's face. He'd spent years admiring his partner's ability to spin anything into gold. But now, all he could see was a man who thrived on deceit. "Yeah," Jack said casually. "I've been thinking about restructuring the partnership. It's time we revisit who handles what." Ethan's smile faltered for a split second. "Restructuring? I thought we had a good balance going." "We do," Jack said, keeping his tone neutral. "But with the company growing, we need to protect ourselves. Maybe tighten up the financial oversight, make sure everything's above board." Ethan's jaw tightened, his smile fading into something colder. "I see where you're going with this." "Good," Jack said, leaning back, "because I've been keeping an eye on things, and I don't like what I've been seeing." Ethan's eyes narrowed. For the first time in years, Jack saw something crack beneath his partner's polished exterior. Fear. Later that night, Jack confronted Laura. He waited until she was in the kitchen, her hands submerged in soapy water as she scrubbed the dinner plates. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, the folder of evidence tucked under one arm. "Laura," he said, his voice low and steady. She glanced over her shoulder, her smile faltering at his tone. "What's wrong?" "I need you to explain something to me," he said, stepping into the room. He placed the folder on the counter and opened it, revealing the photos, the GPS logs, the printed text messages. Laura's face drained of color. She pulled her hands from the sink, drying them on a towel as if stalling for time. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You tell me," Jack replied, "because it looks like my wife and my business partner have been screwing behind my back." Laura's mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment, Jack thought she might try to deny it, but then she broke. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Jack laughed bitterly. "Didn't mean for it to happen? How long, Laura? How long has this been going on?" "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "It started after that company gala." Jack clenched his fists, the memory of that night flashing in his mind. He'd been so proud of her, so grateful for her support. "And Ethan?" Jack pressed. "What's his excuse? Did he convince you this was just business as usual?" Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't like that. I was lonely, Jack. You've been so wrapped up in the company, in everything but us." "Don't you dare blame this on me," Jack snapped. "I've been working my ass off to give us a good life, to make sure we have everything we need. And this is how you repay me." Laura broke down, sinking to the floor as sobs racked her body. But Jack couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the evidence of her betrayal. That night, Jack sat in his office, staring at the folder. The confrontation with Laura had been brutal, but it wasn't enough. Ethan still needed to pay, and Jack knew just how to make it happen. The company's next board meeting was in a week. Jack would use that time to set the stage, ensuring that when Ethan fell, he'd never recover. But as Jack planned his revenge, a nagging thought crept into his mind. What would he do after it was all over? Would he be satisfied, or would the betrayal haunt him forever? The conference room at Summit Solutions was sleek and sterile, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the San Francisco skyline. It was a room built for power moves, and today Jack Murphy intended to make one of his own. The board meeting had started smoothly enough. Ethan, ever the charmer, was presenting the quarterly financials with his usual flair, cracking jokes and throwing around buzzwords that kept the room engaged. Jack let him have his moment, biding his time. And that's why our pivot to the new SaaS model has positioned us for explosive growth in Q3, Ethan concluded, his grin wide as the investors nodded in approval. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Great presentation, Ethan. But before we move on, I'd like to address something that's been troubling me. Ethan's smile faltered for the briefest moment. Of course, Jack. What's on your mind? Jack pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. I've been reviewing our financials, specifically the discretionary spending for the past 6 months. There's a pattern here that I think the board deserves to see. The room grew tense as Jack slid the folder across the table. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen Hawthorne, opened it and began flipping through the pages. Her brow furrowed. What exactly are we looking at, Jack? Karen asked. Jack locked eyes with Ethan, his voice calm but cold. You're looking at unauthorized expenditures tied to Ethan Callaway. Hotel stays, high-end dinners, personal travel. All billed to the company as business development. Ethan's face turned a shade paler. Jack, this is a misunderstanding. Those were client meetings. Don't, Jack interrupted, his tone razor-sharp. Don't insult my intelligence, Ethan. I've cross-referenced the dates with our CRM. There were no client meetings on those days. So, who exactly were you entertaining on the company's dime? The room erupted into murmurs. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Karen cut him off. This is serious, she said, her tone stern. Ethan, if these charges are personal, they're a breach of fiduciary duty. Ethan's charm was cracking under the pressure. Look, I can explain. Save it, Jack said, standing. The evidence speaks for itself. And since we're discussing transparency, there's something else the board should know. Jack walked to the room's touchscreen display and mirrored his laptop. A photo appeared, Ethan and Laura in the hotel parking lot, standing too close for plausible deniability. This, Jack said, his voice heavy with controlled fury, is my business partner and my wife, together, at a hotel, while billing the company for their little rendezvous. The room fell silent, the weight of the accusation hanging thick in the air. Ethan sat frozen, his usual bravado stripped away. Karen closed the folder and looked at Ethan with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. Is this true? Ethan stammered, his confidence crumbling. I can explain. You're done explaining, Jack said, cutting him off. I've already spoken to legal. Per our partnership agreement, any actions that damage the company's reputation are grounds for removal. Effective immediately, Ethan is out. Ethan shot to his feet. You can't do this, Jack. You can't run this company without me. Jack's eyes narrowed. Watch me. The fallout from the meeting was swift and brutal. Ethan was escorted out of the building that same day, his access to company accounts and systems revoked. The board moved quickly to distance Summit Solutions from the scandal, releasing a statement that painted Ethan as a rogue operator who had acted without the company's knowledge. Jack knew the PR spin was necessary, but it felt hollow. The victory, if he could call it that, left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. That evening, Jack returned home to find Laura waiting for him in the living room. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days, her face pale and drawn. I heard, she said quietly as he walked in. Jack dropped his bag by the door and crossed his arms. Good. Saves me the trouble of explaining. Laura stood, wringing her hands. Jack, please. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, rebuild what we had. Jack laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. What we had. Laura. You destroyed what we had the moment you decided to sleep with Ethan. Tears filled her eyes, but Jack didn't soften. He'd spent weeks suffocating under the weight of her lies, and now he was done. I loved you, he said, his voice breaking. I trusted you, and you threw it all away. For what? For him. Laura stepped closer, desperation etched into her features. I made a mistake, Jack. Terrible mistake. But I never stopped loving you. Love. Jack shook his head. Love doesn't do what you did. Love doesn't betray. It doesn't lie. It doesn't destroy. She fell silent, her tears spilling over. For a moment, Jack felt a flicker of sympathy, but he crushed it before it could take root. I'll have the divorce papers drawn up, he said finally. You'll hear from my lawyer. Jack, please. But he turned and walked away, her pleas echoing behind him. In the days that followed, Jack threw himself into his work. Ethan's absence was a relief, but it came with its own challenges. Investors were wary, and the team was shaken by the scandal. Still, Jack pushed forward, determined to rebuild the company and his life from the ground up. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing contracts, his phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Mark. Asterisk dinner on me tonight? You need a break. Jack stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Jack. Asterisk yeah. Thanks. As he grabbed his jacket and headed out, Jack felt the weight of the past few weeks begin to lift. He wasn't whole yet, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he could breathe. And that was a start. Jack Murphy had always believed in clean endings. A problem arose, a solution was found, and life moved forward. But as the weeks turned into months after the confrontation with Laura and Ethan, he realized life rarely adhered to such neat resolutions. The divorce proceedings with Laura were painful but efficient. Jack's lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel Bennett, ensured the terms were clear and fair. Jack kept the house, the car, and his full stake in Summit Solutions. Laura received a modest settlement, enough for her to move on, but not enough to feel like she had one. The final meeting was held in a sterile conference room downtown. Laura sat across from Jack, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. I don't want this to be how it ends, she said softly. As the lawyers stepped out to finalize the paperwork, Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of her choices had aged her overnight. Neither did I, he said. But here we are. I never wanted to hurt you, Jack, Laura continued. I made mistakes, but it wasn't just about Ethan. We were broken long before that. Jack's jaw tightened. Maybe we were, but you didn't give me a chance to fix it. You went to him instead. Laura nodded, her gaze dropping to the table. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, hollow and inadequate. Jack didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Professionally, Summit Solutions began to stabilize. Ethan's removal was a blow to the company's public image, but Jack had worked tirelessly to reassure investors and employees that the future was bright. Karen Hawthorne, impressed by Jack's resilience, offered to introduce him to new potential partners. But Jack wasn't interested in another partnership, not yet. He needed to rebuild on his own terms. One night, as Jack sat in his empty house, he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone. Images of him and Laura at their wedding, laughing with friends at dinner parties, and vacationing in the mountains filled the screen. Each picture felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the life he thought they'd shared. He put the phone down and stared out the window. The house was too quiet now, too big for one person. He thought about selling it, starting fresh somewhere else. But the thought of packing up his memories and leaving felt like another loss he wasn't ready to face. Mark became Jack's lifeline during those dark weeks. They met for dinner regularly, trading war stories about their respective jobs and reminiscing about their college days. You ever think about what's next? Mark asked one evening as they sat in a dimly lit pub. Like, beyond work? Jack shrugged. Not really. Work's all I've got right now. Mark raised an eyebrow. Come on, man. You've got a second chance here. No wife tying you down. No shady business partner holding you back. What do you want? The question lingered with Jack long after the conversation ended. What did he want? For so long, his life had been defined by his marriage and his company. Now, with both fractured, he felt unmoored. A few weeks later, Jack made a decision. He cleared his schedule for a long weekend and drove up the coast to Mendocino, a quiet town he and Laura had visited once years ago. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, its rhythm steady and relentless. Jack found himself sitting on a rocky cliff, watching the waves crash below. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. The ocean didn't care about his betrayal, his heartbreak, or his plans for revenge. It simply existed, constant and unyielding. Jack took a deep breath, letting the salty air fill his lungs. Maybe he didn't need a clean ending. Maybe life was about accepting the mess and finding beauty in the chaos. Back in San Francisco, Jack began making small changes. He sold the house and moved into a modern loft downtown, closer to the pulse of the city. He started running in the mornings, something he hadn't done since his 20s. And he reached out to Karen, not for a partnership, but for advice on expanding Summit Solutions into new markets. Smart move, Karen said over coffee. Diversification is key. You're thinking like a leader. Jack smiled, the first genuine one he'd felt in months. That's the plan. One day, as Jack walked through the bustling streets of the financial district, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Laura. Laura, I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I wish things had been different. Jack stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a response. Jack, I wish they had been too. Take care, Laura. He hit send and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The chapter with Laura was over, but his story was far from finished. Jack didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. The betrayal had broken him, yes, but it had also forced him to rebuild. Stronger, wiser, and perhaps a little less trusting. But as he walked through the city, the hum of life all around him, Jack realized one thing. He wasn't alone. He had his company, his friends, and a future waiting to be written. And that was enough.